Hey guys, it's Robin, RsIslandCrafts, and welcome to my craft room. This week I'm going to show you how I hand stitch a binding down onto this baby quilt. I've already shown you how I machine stitch it, so I thought we'd go ahead and do a little hand stitching. I have done some of it already. I am still using the 2.5 inch binding. I have some of the leftover fabrics that I've incorporated into my binding, and then just a bunch of the blue from the backing. This time I have sewn it on by machine to the front of my quilt. I'm folding it to the back and I'm doing little ladder stitch type stitches to hold it down. I am mitering my corners on both sides. You may notice I have a small amount of binding on the front, just a little over 1/4 inch, and on the back I have about 1/2 inch. It's a little bit wider. That's because I'm using a 2.5 inch binding, so I do have that extra when I wrap it around the back. But one of the things when you're doing the hand stitching is you can see the stitching line here from the front of your quilt. When you wrap it around, you want to make sure you have enough to go past that line. Now sometimes if my stitching it down on the front and I got a little off on my 1/4 inch or whatever you're stitching it down on, sometimes in the past I would have a hard time bringing the binding around to the back to cover that stitching line if I used more of the 2 inch or 2 1/4 inch binding. So I just went ahead and stuck with my 2.5. It's not going to hurt anything that it goes past that stitching line. It just covers up a little bit more, has a little bit larger of a border on the back of the quilt. But if you're using your backing fabric as your binding, it's all going to blend in anyways and it's not going to matter. So it's all becomes part of personal preference. Now remember, this is the utilitarian quilts. I'm making these for donations or for gifts or for myself. These are not going in a quilt show, but I will give you some tips from what I have read online about quilt shows. But I am no way near a professional. I have never put a quilt in a show. So if that's something you need to know about, that's something you're going to have to research on your own a little bit more. But I'll give you a couple of the tips and tricks that I have heard from. And it's always nice to do the best you can, even though it's just a quilt for yourself or for a baby that's going to get loved so much that it's going to have holes in it and fall apart. There are times that I just like to practice being perfect, to know that I can do it, even though I'm not feeling the pressure that I have to be perfect all the time. A part of being perfect when you're stitching this down by hand is to make sure if you're doing a quilt show quilt, your stitches can't show at all. A judge will get up really close and personal and look to make sure they can't see any of your thread. So it's a good idea to match your thread. I would say match it to the binding so it can't be seen. Maybe someone else might say you should match it to the backing. That's one of those things you might have to research on your own. And your stitches, even though you can't see them, you can't see the thread, but you can see the kind of little tucks where the stitches come in and out. When you're doing it for a quilt show, it needs to be precisely, let's say 1/8 of an inch apart. Each and every one should be equally a distance apart. You shouldn't have long gaps and tight gaps. But when I'm doing it for my own quilt or for my own personal use or for a gift, I'm not super precise. I try to make them nice and even because it's good practice for other things. Like if you're hand stitching the buttonhole stitch, it's really nice to have all those nice and uniform. So this is a good time to practice. Even though we're not doing that stitch, we're going to practice keeping an eye on our distances. It's good when you're hand quilting also because you want to make sure your stitches are nice and even and the same width apart from all your other stitches so it's nice and uniform. So even though we're not doing those precise actions, it's good practice to get your hand and your eyes coordinated to be able to see if things are lining up nicely and you don't have wide gaps. Now the mitered corners is really a big deal for a judge. They have an index card or some other card that they sit in here to make sure that you have that perfect degree here. They want the line, you're binding to line up with their card here and the line up there, and they like to have that miter. And whether it has to both be in the same direction or a different direction, I can't remember how they line up, if they both face the same way or different ways. But I just kind of do, my front one goes one way and my back one goes this way. I don't know how that works, but I do know it's very precise in a contest when you're being judged and stuff, that those are some of the things I've heard other people on blogs say this is where they got points taken off because they didn't have that perfect corner, or their miters weren't in the proper direction, or their stitches were the wrong width or can be visible. They will check on the front too to make sure that you have the proper distance all the way through. If you have a 1/4 inch, then they want to see it a 1/4 inch all the way through. I don't know if there's a specific rule about how wide your binding can and can't be. Again, something you'd have to look up. But it is good for us to practice to have it really nice. You wouldn't want to have a little bit of a scant 1/4 inch and then have it get really wide unless you have that specifically going throughout your entire quilt. Okay, that's enough from someone who doesn't enter quilt shows for giving any type of information. That is not my knowledge base, but let me show you how I go ahead and do my hand stitching. I've seen some people where they keep, like I keep all the extra bits of the quilt into my lap so I have the binding at the top, and I've seen other people flip it around so that the quilt is at the top and the binding's at the bottom. Personal preference, I imagine. I like to have the weight of the quilt in my lap. I usually sit down in a chair, comfortable like my recliner, while I'm hand stitching and watching a movie or watching podcasts or something like that. I very seldom sit anywhere. I never sit anywhere unless I'm talking to you guys where I'm going to put a project on a table to be displayed out like this, because it's just not comfortable. Putting binding down could take you several hours, depending on the size of your quilt. I've done a king size quilt before where it's taken a couple hours just to do one side. So, you know, you're talking 8 to 12 hours for the entire quilt, depending on how slow and how close your stitches are and how precise you are. But don't let that deter you, because as you're hand stitching, it's a very relaxing process. That's, as I said, you're hanging out with friends and chit-chatting or watching a movie, listening to an audiobook or some music. And you're just going to be stitching away and you're not even going to notice the time that goes by. Needle preference is up to you. I've seen people use the tiny little quilting needles and longer ones, really thin ones. I just have a basic average size needle. I just got it out of a multi-pack. It's got a nice little sharp tip. I can get the thread through the eye easily, so I'm happy. I'm just using some cotton thread that I normally use for sewing anyways. This is the same thread that I've used to stitch down the binding with by machine. It's just a basic navy blue. I have a standard little knot at the tip. You could put a quilter's knot in there like you would if you were actually quilting it. I just do one of those knots where you wrap it around your finger and you kind of take your thumb and roll it off. Hold it with your nail and it just makes a little knot on there. This is going to get tucked inside the binding, so for me the size of the knot doesn't matter. Of course I wouldn't want something really huge in there that you can feel. This is going to be a single thread. It's not going to be folded over and doubled at all. I like to work with about 8 arm's length, just so that you're going to be pulling your needle through your binding and your batting and your fabric and all that over and over again, and you wouldn't want a lot of fraying to go on because this thread's going to be getting pulled multiple times. It's usually better to go with a shorter length and have to start a new thread more often than it would be for a longer length, because you want to have a strong thread. You don't want it to be worn out from being pulled through constantly. I do keep it doubled over for about 1/2 or 3/4 of it, and I just pull it out as I go. I don't think that really matters too much of anything. It's just something I do. I do like to put the little clips on when I'm hand stitching. I just like to have it folded over so that the binding is ready for me as I'm sliding my hand down. I definitely like to do them when I'm mitering my corners. I'll go ahead and stick a clip right there. I just kind of take it off and save my last clip to put in there. I do not have enough clips to do a king size quilt, but I had enough that I could put it on this baby quilt. I don't put them any equal distance apart or anything. I just kind of a hand and a half or something. Just like I said, to hold it down. The binding tends to have a nice memory. I have given it a good press from the other side like we did with the machine sewn so that it easily comes over. I don't want to have any extra folded over or anything, so I don't want any folds and tucks. So I open up my binding here, and I like to go where we stitch down the binding, so from on the front of the quilt. And I just go ahead and bury my knot through there, through all of that fabric and the binding and the batting and everything. I do like to use a thimble. I put it on my middle finger because that's the one I tend to push things through. Mine has this nice little metal thing, but I tend not to actually use the metal part. I always seem to be hitting down here or something. That's just the way I stitch, and I have always stitched, so it's kind of nice to have that metal piece there if you're doing quilting and you need to rock it or something. All these little divots hold the end of your needle nicely, but I don't use it. Then I will come up in between the two folds of the binding. This is going to be like the ladder stitch when we close up a bag or something, where we're going to go down and over and down and over and down, just like that. The first few times you do this, your stitches may or may not show. I notice as I stitch, the longer I stitch on this, like at the end of the day or something, and my hands and my eyes start to get a little tired, then I can start to see my stitches are visible, and I'll start seeing them come up to the top like this instead of being tucked and hidden into the binding, and that's fine too. It's just something, if you're going to do that, you want to have it visible all the way through. So after coming out of the binding, when I go into my quilt, I'm going to go, some people like to just go through this top piece of fabric. I like to grab some of the batting too. I feel like it adds a little extra support, like I'm stitching through more layers that way, so it's going to hold it better. You just need to be careful that you don't come all the way through to the front. I like to keep a finger back here, so I will poke myself if I've gone in too far, and I can also, as I'm pulling the thread through, if I've gone all the way through without poking myself, I could feel that thread pulling across my finger. I actually feel that little, not like a rope burn, but you can feel the thread running across your finger. And I know, stop and check. Every so many stitches, I will fold it back and just make sure I haven't gone through. I am using the dark navy blue on black. While it can be noticeable, it won't be very, so sometimes I can get away with it. If I had stitched all the way through on the very first leg of doing it, I may or may not go through and fix it. I usually leave it if it's my quilt and fix it if it's someone else's. You can also go through with a little black Sharpie and color over any thread that's coming through, and that will last for a very long time, if not forever. But of course, that's not going to work for a quilt show contest or something like that. The judges know to look for those little tricks, but you can go ahead and use a fabric marker or a Sharpie and paint it whatever color, marker it whatever color your fabric is, and it'll blend right in. Especially if you're using like a white thread on a black or red fabric. Okay, let's get to the binding. Then when I come out of the binding for the first time, I'm going to follow parallel through, and I'm going to go into the fabric and the batting, and I'm just going to take a little bit of a bite, and then I'm going to come back through. Now this little bite is going to be underneath the binding, so when I pull this, the binding will come over it a little bit. Then right along this folded edge on my binding, I'm going to go ahead and slide my needle in, following right along the edge. Just take a little bit of a bite that way and pull it through. Now as you get going, now when I come back into my fabric, right where I came out of my binding, I'm going to go back in. About 1/8 of a, 1/4 of a, whatever of an inch you're doing, if you're trying to space it nicely and evenly. And I come out of my binding, and I'm going to go right back into my fabric, right where I came out, right next to that little spot. So now I'm going to go ahead and go through my fabric and my batting, and I'm going to bring my needle up, rock it up a little bit, so I come out that distance that I wanted, and I'm going to poke right into my binding and go down that little bit of space and come back out. So instead of taking 2 stitches there, now I've just gone ahead and taken one. I just took 1 little stitch instead of 2. So I could go and just go into the quilt and then into the binding. You can go a little bit underneath that folded part, so if you think you're going to be showing it all, and that'll hide a lot of your extra little tucks and divots, and it'll pull the binding over. and that'll cover up, because sometimes it's very noticeable, especially if you pull it super tight. I'm just giving it a nice little tug so that it lays flat and I pulled all my thread through, making sure that I can feel the edge of my quilt right here in my binding. So I'm just going to go ahead and speed you up a little bit. I'm going to keep doing this until I get down to the corner, and then we're going to go ahead and miter that corner. As I'm going, when I start to get the clips where my hand is, I go ahead and just slide this down a little bit. I'd like to maybe split the distance between this clip and that clip. If I have, like right here, I have a seam from putting these bindings together. Sometimes I'll put it right on the seam just to remind myself. So when I get here, I'm going to show you what I do on the seam. I don't think it really matters anything, but sometimes I like to do things because it makes me feel better, and I feel like it's creating a stronger thing. Whether it does or not, I don't know, but I feel better, and that's really sometimes all that matters. Hopefully my hand is staying out of the way. I'm trying, when you're doing your binding, you definitely don't want to do this with your wrist. You want to make sure you have a straight line here, and that's what I normally do. That's why I angle. I hold it with my hand and I will move my quilt instead of moving my hand and my wrist. But because we're trying to be able to see what's going on here, I'm going to go ahead and try to keep my hand out of the way. I'm only going to do it for a short distance, so I'm not going to be causing any type of damage. Sometimes I just catch a couple threads and I got to pull my needle back out and just try again. You'll find a little rhythm as you're going, and you won't even be really paying that much attention. You'll get used to and kind of go on autopilot while you're watching your movie or chatting with your friends. Check to make sure everything looks good. Okay, so I'm going through right here, and I noticed that I got it going a little too fast, and I could see my thread come out here. So I can go ahead and take this. I pull the thread out of my needle, or grab a second needle. You're going to need to take your needle off anyways. I just pull my thread out. There's the one stitch. So here's the one where it came out too high. And just pull it up here. A little hard to see with the blue thread, but just pull it out. And I can rethread my needle. And I would do the same thing if I found that I went through all the way to the other side. I would just pull it out. I'm going to stitch down to here, and then I'm going to show you how I handle that little join. As I'm getting close to this join, I try to be really conscious, because when I come out this last time, I want to make sure that I'm coming out of this fabric of my quilt a little bit close, but I want to be able to put a stitch that goes from this part of this fabric and comes over the join and out this fabric. So I want to be conscious that I'm going to come up really close to where it's coming out, but not too far back and not past. So sometimes I might shorten my stitches a little, or lengthen them a little. Okay, so when I come out, I'm going to come into my fabric here, and I want to slide it through so that I go from one fabric to the other, and I've gone and I've crossed over that seam. As I said, I don't know that this makes any bit of difference, but I like to have that extra little bit. Instead of pulling down on either side, it comes across and pulls on that entire seam. In my mind, it feels a little more secure, but I could be totally making it up just to make myself feel better. No harm comes from it. It's not causing any damage, so I'm good, right? As I'm getting closer to the corner, I'll go ahead and take my clip off. I take the binding that I'm working on and I let that go straight. And I take this next section and I fold it over. And I want to have that nice little angle there, and I want this to fold over so that this piece once again here matches up there. I don't want it to cross over, and I don't want it to leave a big gap here. I want to have it just so it all has that nice little angle and matches up nicely. And then I'll pop a clip on it. Now I'm pretty sure I have a video where I showed some, if not all, of how to do the hand stitching of the binding down in the past. I think it might have been part of another project that I was doing, so I kind of showed maybe a couple things at once. I'm not sure. I'm going to see if I can find that video, and I'll pop it in the iCard at the end of the video here. You'll be able to see it there, and if you want to see another video, maybe I talked about something different back then and give a little different tips and tricks. Maybe there's a better view and an angle for it if you want to watch that one. I have another seam here, so I'm going to go ahead and be careful there. Come up on one side, come out the other. Stab myself in the thumb. I stab myself here a lot. I probably should put a thimble on that thumb, but I'm just not used to having one there. After I come through, I do, like I said, I push it through the needle with my middle finger that way. And when I'm coming up to the corner, let me make sure you guys can see I'm in the right spot. Okay, you guys will be able to see good there. So as I'm coming up, I do remove my clip because I want to stitch all the way up to the sewn line from when I put it down by machine on the front. As I get going, and I'm going to be underneath the miter there, I don't care where my stitches are and how they show. As long as they don't show on the front, I'm happy. So if I get into the binding a little, as long as it's part where it's going to be covered up, you're never going to see it. But I want to tack this straight line. I want to keep going until I get at least to the stitching line. And then I will go up from the quilt part here, still only going through the batting in the top. And I'll come up right near where that stitch is. I'm going to go ahead and knot this off. I'm not going to cut my thread, but I like to put a little knot there. That gives me a nice stopping point. If anything happens here, this is where it's going to come unthreaded. My corner tends to be totally separate from either section because I put a knot at the beginning and a knot at the end. Refold my binding, and now what I do here is I like to slip into this little, when you push it down you can give it a little finger press, and this little fold right here, I'm going to work in this fold and in this little part on the top of this owl's head, and I'm going to hand stitch this little mitered corner down so that it's not flopping open in the breeze. I know it's a little hard to see because it's brown. Now these corners may look loosey-goosey, but they are being held down by a thread. I just have it underneath this little fold, so the top of the fold will puff up, but the actual bottom side is stitched down. It just helps keeping that miter in place and it behaves. So I just come at the point right here where that line comes. I just kind of put my needle in the fold and I want to come out. You get this little dimple up here when you're doing the miter this way, when I fold this stuff and I fold the next side over. You can put a little clip here if you want, if it stays out of your way. And that's going to hold that fabric down for you. So I'm just going to go into this fold and I'm going to come out maybe a 1/4 inch, a little less than a 1/4 inch from that little dimple there. I don't want to mess with the dimple and I don't want to mess with the actual corner. I just want to tack this fold down a little bit. And then I'm going to go underneath this fold. I'm not going to go any close like we were doing here. I want to actually make sure the stitch is hidden. Take a piece of this fabric. And then I'm going to come back up and grab that fold and come back out the edge. Give it a nice little tug. And that's going to go ahead and hold that mitered edge down there. Then I just, where these two pieces meet, I like to just sneak up in there, grab a little stitch between the fabric, the binding, and I pop a little knot in there. And now that's going to hold my corner in place for me, so everything's going to be nice and lined up, and hopefully it keeps it nice and secure. So basically this thread is now coming out of the top of the binding, so just right next to this binding, I go ahead, our first piece here, I just dip into the little blue background fabric, grab a little bit, and grab a little bit of the binding. It's a little bit of a tight spot in there, but just get one little stitch in, and then you can get right back into your rhythm of doing your little ladder stitch to hold everything down. And that's it. You just keep working your way through. I'm going to get past this join and I'll show you how I finish it off. I have all of this to do, but of course I'm going to run out of thread before I get there. I usually have enough thread the way I pull it to do one side of the quilt, and then I go ahead and I trim it off. I like to, hopefully I can get past the corner just enough to where I'm not trying to trim it off in the corner. So I either want to stop before the corner if I think I'm going to run out, or I stop afterwards. Of course, if you're doing a smaller project or you've chosen to have a longer length of thread, you can go as far as you want past the corner. Just because you passed it doesn't mean you have to cut your thread. Okay, once I've gone past that corner and I'm ready to finish off of this thread, I would go a little bit further than this, but I want to go ahead and show you how to tie it off. I am coming out of the binding and I'm going to do it just like I showed you on the other side. I'm going to go right into the quilt backing just a little bit, and in the same, when I go into the quilt backing, I'm going to go right next to where I came out. And when I come back up through my needle, I'm going to put it maybe behind that first stitch or next to it, just so I'm not coming through the same exact spot. Grab that loop. Give it a nice little tug to tie it off. You can go through the loop twice if you want. Then I just go ahead and I bury this into the batting. Make sure it's not showing anywhere on the front. Pull on the thread. See how when I pull on it, it kind of grabs the quilt and bunches it up a little bit right here, so that when I snip my thread, the thread will just go boing and gets pulled right into that binding. Right into that batting. Now, because I'm using cotton batting, as I wash it, that batting is just going to go ahead, just like if you were using wool batting, it's going to grab onto those threads, it's going to mesh itself all around it, and it's all going to become one. It's all very zen-like. And that's it. That is how I hand stitch my binding down. So I'm going to go ahead and continue on and finish this stuff while watching something on YouTube today, or I've been rewatching The Librarians on Hulu. I feel like it's really nice to do bindings in the winter because the quilt lays on your lap and keeps you nice and warm, but I probably wouldn't suggest saving up all of your bindings for the winter time, because then all you'll be doing is binding your quilts and you probably will get bored and not want to do it. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and finish up hand stitching this binding down. I think my corners came out really nice and everything is laying down nicely. So this is going to be a cute little quilt. Once this one is all finished, I will pop it into the washing machine with the other little baby quilt, and then I'll work on getting all of these threads off. And I'll show you guys definitely what they look like on a Whip It Wednesday when they're all crinkly and freshly washed. So if you have any questions, go ahead and leave them down in the comments. Thanks for hanging out with me in the craft room today. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.